For this morning, Professor Alina Mungiu Pipidi, and I would ask you then afterwards to come to the stage. She's a president of the Romanian Academic Society and a professor in comparative politics, and she's been really heavily involved in the anti-corruption work in Romania, and she will tell us a little bit more about that now.
So good morning, everybody. Before I start, I'm Alina, and I'm Romanian, and a professor of comparative public policy in Rome, after having been for 15 years a professor of democracy. Actually, I had a nice democracy chair in Berlin, in Germany. And I'd like, before we start, people who are Romanian in this audience, please raise your hands. Okay, thank you. That's a little bit what I thought. All right, so I'll spend my 15 minutes mixing a little bit the story of the country you're in and bringing forward what may seem as an academic, but in fact it's a very actionable point. One minor point in the theory of democracies, which is, why do countries democratize? Due to domestic agency or due to external intervention? Or if it is a mix, what is the most, the happiest social engineering which can bring good democracies, consolidated democracies to completion? Now, the short and brutal answer is that in 1989, when I was 25, this country was destined to move from Ceausescu's regime to a regime of Ceausescu's son. There was no other predictable future. Today people make institutes which are called Institute of Futures. There's a proliferation of those, or project of futures, as in potential plural futures. But at the time, there seemed to be only one future. Even that was not bad. Ceausescu's son had drinks with my colleague students. Romania were automatically enrolled in the Association of Communist Students. So if you ask yourself, have I been a communist student, despite being a well-known anti-communist in Romania, the answer is yes, I have been a communist student. We were. Membership was automatic. You became a student in this country, you also became a student of Association of Communist Students. And I even edited together with some other colleagues, a newspaper, actually it was more of a magazine, called The Opinion of Students, who 2 years prior to 1989 could not be published because we were trying our luck. Censorship had been officially closed in Romania, which made it far worse, because instead of one official censor to go to with your magazine, you were sending it around for consultation, and everybody could block it. The party, the Secret Service, literally everybody. A rector or a dean who didn't like what you wrote about him could block this magazine. So 2 years prior to the revolution, we have never managed to publish. We wrote, we made entire issues, and then we distributed, some is that like, we made copies and distributed them around. So the day when Ceausescu fled, we reopened the radio station in our university city in Romania, which had been closed for the past 2-3 years. Again, an unclear reason, but they had closed all provincial radio stations. And we put out an ad to all former students who had been editors of these newspapers to show up in order to start a free newspaper. We already had issues which had been printed but never distributed. We went to the printing house. There was nobody to stop us that day. I'm talking the Romanian Revolution Day. We took out all the newspapers and gave them freely in the street. And this is how Romanian free press started after 1989. Unfortunately, it didn't last like this, because after 2 weeks of glory and triumph, having become the first free newspaper in this country, we discovered, and confiscating basically the print press from communist newspapers, because they didn't dare to show up to work the next day, so they couldn't very well stop us. And the print press workers were very happy to print us, because they were also on the side of revolution. But in 2 weeks we ran out of paper. And then we thought, but how the hell is this media working where it is working, the free media? Oh, they buy paper. Oh, they sell newspapers. Oh, that's really terrible. And this is how capitalism began. And we've been in this ever since. It was far nicer and less romantic than we thought. But anyway, instantaneously, we turned into opinion leaders, well-known people were all multiplying our papers, and our lives changed. And I was a medical student, and then I changed, turned into a political scientist, went to Harvard to study political scientist, and into a journalist. I had the privilege in this country of firing Ceausescu's anchors from Romanian public television, the same who told us in 1989 that this was no revolution but some Arab terrorists shooting our protest ralliers. But all this is very much in the past, so I show my age with all these stories. But why had these stories, even were possible in a country which had no future a year before? Well, the simple reason is that context enabled it. The fact that all the countries around us were free. The fact that there was no threat in this country, for instance, that Russia would come in. Russia left this country in 1964, unlike Central Europe, or where I lived for the past 15 years, in East Berlin. Right? In East Berlin, Russia had to leave. So in East Berlin, they still have a little bit, they have a lot of things to hate Russia for, but they also have a little bit to be grateful for. I was there 2 years ago at the Falling Walls conference when Angela Merkel towards no, 2 years ago, must be 4 years ago, of course before the Russian invasion in Ukraine, towards the Russian minister present, and said, what a good time I still can remember when Russians were leaving this place. And we were so grateful for you for leaving. Why didn't you just kept leaving and return? So there was no threat here, and therefore no external threat of intervention, and therefore the Romanian transition was very much like a civil war, because our communists in 1964 had been inflicted by Romanians. It's them who were the authoritarian class here, and the entire transition was a conflict between various categories of Romanians. And the light at the end of the tunnel came to the fact that this very strong incentive existed, the membership to European Union in particular, and to NATO, so security and prosperity, and this united all these people together. But then, of course, and now I'm walking through my academic papers, of course, what followed up was not a clean transition, a very clean success for us, anti-communists in this country, because as you look at us, I can tell you that we have never been able to get 51% in any vote in this country. Everything was done due to this very strong incentive with the others, basically. So we didn't have the kind of radical lustratia from Eastern Germany, or from Estonia, or from the Czech Republic, or from Poland. We progressed in our democratization with a lot of compromises. We couldn't really clean up here. We just agreed on the future, and we compromised, and we made on. So in my former papers, when I was still writing about Romania, this was called democratization without decommunization, and then Europeanization without democratization, basically, right? So these are really don't sound like ideal models, but they did. And what happened meanwhile, I was yesterday in a conference in the Bundestag to celebrate 20 years after enlargement to East Central Europe, and people asked, why is Romania doing so well? Where's Romania now? Doing so fabulously well. I said the answer is very simple, I mean, I had a Hungarian on the left and a Pole on the right. I said if they made steps back, out of the sudden Romania became a front runner, right? Okay, it's not that we're better than we ever were, but now we are ahead. And of course, one reason which really helps us is geopolitics a lot. This is a country which has firm interests which divide us from Russia, and therefore that is why unlike Hungary or unlike Bulgaria, who may cut deals or they may do whatever, we can't. I mean, Moldova cannot be Russia's and ours in the same time, neither can the continental gas in the Black Sea. I mean, interests have always been dividing us. And for us, this is not such a bad situation after all, because finally it's not just us against Russia, but everybody else is. Okay, I'm not saying it's a good situation, not at all. But more or less, this is how very well, the context helped us get here. And of course, the best moment when the countries made progress were moments when we had domestic agency coming together and getting a little bit of progress. But otherwise, as literature and scholarship shows, European enlargement creates a favorable environment, but it cannot substitute itself to domestic reformers who want to get somewhere. And it didn't even today, and therefore if you look around in this country, it's not really the happiest country in the world. And I think it's rich. I think economically Romania is doing superbly well. Anyway, better than Hungary, which again, if you're Romanian, ask a Romanian and he'll explain to you that this is a traditional rivalry. So saying better than Hungary is great, but ask people and you'll be surprised that for so many years, people in public opinion surveys say that this country is headed in the wrong direction. And if it's something that people are unhappy about, is with the quality of democracy. Although I think we did a lot. I mean, in corruption, where I was the most involved, we did a lot. But then, you know, at the end, the context enables you, but the context doesn't do things for you. And the compromises that people make during the years, if you do not become strong enough, if you do not have a critical mass to create standards and be able to enforce standards, you know, they will get to you. The country that we're in now presently is ruled by a class of generals. I mean, again, ask Romanians and you'll find out wonderful anecdotes. A class of generals who all have PhDs, and this is why they're constantly in the news, because now we also have a nice free media. That is the positive legacy of the anecdote I told you about the opinion of students. The one nice thing that we kept is media, and it's difficult to shut media. Whatever you do, you know, your social media will be left, and social media has good people, not only bad people, as you seem to think these days. And media has exercised its oversight role. So you can read, in Romania you have, you know, generals running a lot of things, more than they should be. It's probably the only country in Europe where a secret service organizes officially the digital platform for elections, the vaccination, and pretty much everything else, you know. And do not be surprised if they have very attentively screened even participants to this conference. Because these days you cannot be a minister in this country or a deputy minister unless you have done at least a summer school at one of the security academies, and not since the war is here, since 20 years it's here, right? So there is this paradox. On one hand you have this ruling class, on the other hand you have a free media, so people do report about this, people do say this is a plagiarism, is whatever, but people feel it as a non-accomplishment. And if I look at the great figures of Romania's anti-corruption, people with whom I had the honor to be in the same coalition in the years 2000, the main judge, and I'll just stick to this example, who sentenced all the oligarchs in this country because we had our great moment that in Ukraine never came, for instance, right? Because it's a difficult moment to have. It's a moment which will deeply shake all your politics. Romania put in jail over 18 ministers, the prime minister, the entire family of our former president, and even, you know. So that is a number of these generals. I mean, we could not put them all because they're all into it, but at least a few, right? And if you look what happened with the judge who did the bravest sentence on this judge had been excluded from magistracy in this country as we speak, which is a clear example for all the other judges that nobody should ever do what she did. And we struggled a lot with my friends at National Endowment for Democracy in Washington to help her. We fought the situation in various courts. But more than the bad guys against whom she was after, she was in the end sentenced by the lack of courage of the magistracy in this country to rally around her. They all hated her simply because she tried to prove that you can judge a trial in a week instead of 7 years, as they generally do in corruption cases, hoping that something will happen, someone will take their case, and they will not be involved in this controversial thing. So context is changing. The context today is far worse than it was when we became democratic. The same thing can be said for some of the Western Balkan countries, some of the Eastern Balkan countries. And we have to fight to keep some of this context favorable, because domestic reformers do exist. They exist everywhere. I mean, Moldova next to us is the best example. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting these mayors from Moldova. I've shot a documentary with a Reuters journalist 15 years ago when we were on where should Europe end. In fact, it was just advocacy for liberalizing visas to Moldovans and Ukrainians. And we were very impressed by the quality of mayors, particularly mayors on the borders who saw Europe down there, and they knew that only a river separates them from El Dorado. So I'm really glad that today there are steps ahead, that they're integrated, and that the European Union, I think this week or a few days ago, even signed some sort of border management agreement with Moldova. I mean, this doesn't mean much because we have no troops to send to Moldova, we as EU. Or we have no troops to send to Ukraine. Even the discussion is controversial, but it will mean much, because as we will discover, and with this I end, the traditional tools which enabled a more favorable context, and which I have seen working in Western Balkans, like European enlargement, just give somebody a perspective and the rest will happen. This tool worked in an environment where security was ensured by someone else, right? By NATO bombing Belgrade, for instance. I'm not saying that's a good thing and we should do this again. But that's how it worked. And if you lose security, the tools of the foreign policy tools of the European Union are weak. Yes, we have our values. Yes, we strongly project what the model should be. So yes, we give people something to rally around. We call this a gravity model. You know, people are attracted towards our gravity model. All this is true, but there are some essentials, and the essential thing is security. You have to ensure this for all the rest of democratization to come into place. And even then, as I try to tell you, illustrating with the Romanian example, it's not an easy job. Thank you.